everybody. This is Sarah, and you're listening to the Medium Curious Podcast, the show hosted by two mediums who are curious about everything. Like consciousness, chatting with spirit, being spirit stuffed in these little bodies, and about intuition and all of our different experiences. And I guess that's what I'm bringing to the table today, my experience with religion growing up, because I believe that we all sign up for this earth school to have experiences that help our souls grow. And we are all going to experience things differently. Even the same experience is going to be experienced differently. And when I started thinking about this episode, I posed this question. What do you do when the framework for your life, like the religion that you grew up with, or even an ideology that has served you in the past, no longer fits who you are today? Because what I've learned is that spirituality and faith aren't static. They're not a fixed target. And they're fluid. They change with everything that we experience in our life. And I have learned to hold space for that expansion and evolution, and for the fact that what's true for me today may look completely different than what was true for me 10 years ago or what is true for me 10 years from now. Because we're supposed to change. We're supposed to grow and evolve. And my hope is that this episode today helps you know that you don't need permission to change your mind about your belief system, and that the ultimate litmus test for our beliefs is this: does it move you closer to love, or does it hold you in fear? Jane and I just released an episode about spiritual rules last week. You know, like the rules worth following and the rules worth letting go. And in it, I think I mentioned that I was going to share my experience with growing up with religion. And honestly, I'm still unpacking it, even as I'm approaching my 5th decade in this lifetime. And it feels really personal, and there's still lots of layers that are working their way through my awareness. And I want to be careful to share my story and not the story of my family of origin. But I'm putting this out there because I'm pretty sure there are others out there who can relate. And this is not a judgment. This is just my experience, and it has shaped who I am. And there is so much about my childhood that I am so grateful for, and about my experience, because some of the friction it created has been some of my most important fuel for my growth. So I grew up going to church, like lots of church. And my parents, when they were newlyweds, they found themselves living in northern Alberta, Canada, which was several thousand miles away from their family and their friends who were on the east coast of the United States. And then they had 3 kids in rapid succession. So by the time I was 3.5, I had 2 little sisters. And church became extended family, and church was community and support, and it was a lifeline to my mom especially. She used to say that it was the only place that she got to have adult conversations because her kids were in the nursery or in Sunday school. And I also went to a private Christian school from kindergarten through 8th grade, and this school, I think it was like kindergarten through 12th grade, and there was only 100 kids in it. So that's a very small pool of kids. And I like, just to give an example of what we did, we had Bible drills where we'd all hold our Bibles up and they would call out a Bible verse, and whoever was the first one to find it in their Bible won. I also committed huge chunks of scripture to memory, and it really was a full immersion. I knew the Bible like the back of my hand. And I remember at 6, because I had heard so much about what a precious and meaningful thing it was to accept Jesus into your heart. I didn't even know what that meant. I remember visualizing Jesus actually in my heart. I did. I earnestly and sincerely asked Jesus to be in my heart, and I meant it. I loved the hymns. I loved the songs. I loved the sing-alongs. I loved the music productions. I loved the Bible stories, which those of you who know the Bible are actually pretty epic. There's parables, there's characters, and there's lots of generations of begetting. Abraham begot Isaac, Isaac begot Jacob, and so on and so forth. So it's so immense. And there's a reason why that book has stuck around. And also the practice of prayer itself, the act of bringing something heavy, concern, needs to God and asking for help, and then releasing it to a higher power. There's something really beautiful about that, especially when it's held in community, and especially for a kid who really needed to be seen and cared for. And it was an environment that had all the answers. They were provided by the Bible, by the pastor, by the Sunday school teacher. And if you had a question, you pray. If you have a problem, you pray. If you had any sort of question, you look for the answer in your Bible. And that initially, I think, as a kid felt pretty comforting. But there was also heaven and hell and sin, this idea that every single person is born a sinner and has to be cleansed by the blood of Christ to earn their way into heaven. And that was a lot for a sensitive kid to carry. And I took it very seriously. I wanted to be a good girl, one who was worthy of the love of a God who had the power to send me to heaven or hell. And I constantly worried about the people around me who I thought may not be Christians, like terrified that they'd be separated from me for eternity, because there was so much talk about eternity. I remember traveling with my family to Florida to visit my grandparents. And I remember sitting on my grandpa's knee while he was watching a soap opera and worrying and saying, "Grandpa, are you going to hell for watching that?" Because I had been told that soap operas were sinful. He just laughed, of course. He thought that was hilarious. And I had questions about kids in other countries who had never even heard of Jesus. Were they going to hell? And the answer for that was pretty simple. Well, that's why they're missionaries. And when I had questions that didn't have easy answers, the response was always some sort of version of read your Bible, pray more, deepen your faith. And the questions that I had, the message that I received, that I felt, and this was just the perception of me as a kid, was that the problem was me. And I also heard a lot, you can't cherry pick which parts of the Bible that you want to follow. It's all or nothing, which, yikes, that's intense. And as I continued to grow, there was a lot that didn't add up to me. Like, the man as the head of the household. That was presented as God's design and the right and natural order of things. And yet it was so obvious, even as a little kid, that it was really my mom who was taking care of everything. And even science class, evolution, we didn't talk about that. We talked about creationism, that God created the world in 7 days. Yeah. I also had this question that nobody really seemed to give me a good answer on. Like, who wrote the Bible? If it was God's word, did God literally write it? And if people back then were able to hear God and write down what he was saying, why can't people do that now? And when I noticed the contradictions, I wasn't encouraged to ask questions. Questioning felt rebellious. There was a lot of talk about being rebellious, and it felt like I was disrespecting my elders. And it kind of felt like evidence that I wasn't being obedient, because that was also talked about quite a bit. And there was also this idea that Christians needed to keep themselves separate from the rest of the world, from the secular world. So there was always this sense of us and them, the saved and the unsaved, the righteous and everyone else who is different. And as I started to get older, I just wanted to fit in with everyone else. I wanted to feel normal. Even different denominations were looked at sideways, which felt crazy. And Catholics, were they even Christians? They may as well be headed to hell too. Hey, just kidding, Catholics. Not true, not true. There are no Catholics in hell. There is no hell. But that's a lot to carry as a kid. But here's what I also saw. I saw my mom's faith, which was a real comfort to her. And she really took peace in her faith. And when things got hard, she had a genuine relationship with the divine that gave her comfort. And I didn't see this type of relationship replicated anywhere else in the church experience that I grew up in. And when I was born, she had a near-death experience. She nearly died when I was born. And she was really grateful to be alive. And again, that's not my story to tell, but I know that it served as a profound awakening for her. And it gave her a closeness to God that was real and deep and personal. And I know that she wanted her kids to have that. And she didn't want us to have to go through the searching and the questioning that she had gone through as a teenager and a young adult. And knowing this has given me a lot of compassion and helped me release some of the anger that I have had around growing up with that type of indoctrination. Because my mom had a profound spiritual awakening, and she genuinely wanted to pass it on. And my dad also had lost his brother when he was in his early 20s. So Christianity was, I will see him in heaven one day. So they wanted to pass that on to us. But that kind of awakening, that kind of spirituality has to be lived. You can't pass it on to somebody. It has to be experienced. It has to be your own. I also asked my parents why they chose to send us to a Christian school, and they said they wanted to keep us safe and to protect us from a world that felt big and felt scary. And so that's a lot of what I absorbed, a framework built around its core of fear, and fear of people who were different from us, fear of people that could hurt us, fear of different beliefs, and a fear of hell. But the intention, I think, was out of love to provide safety and security and comfort. And it all shifted. It all changed when we moved to the United States. When I was in 9th and 10th grade, I went from that private Christian school to a huge public high school, and the wheels on the Christian school bus came off. And of course, looking back on it now, it makes total sense what happened next. The moment I got a whiff of the secular world, there were a lot more questions that I needed to be answered. And then I left for college, for Northwestern University, which was a couple thousand miles away from home. And my belief system changed again. I was now in academia. I was living in the science world now, the material world. Science was what I believed in, what I believed to be true, and I didn't need a higher power when the focus was on achievement and the reward of hard work. I was studying hard, working hard, and playing hard, but I really was not aware of the huge burden of shame that I was hauling around behind me. And there was some grief in there too. There was a loss I didn't really have a language for, and I mostly ignored. I had once had this belief in something bigger than myself, and now I was pretty sure that it wasn't real. Because if the religion I was raised in claimed to be the one and only way, and it couldn't make room for something as basic as evolution, then maybe it was all fantasy. And if it was all fantasy, then prayer must be a silly waste of time. And that was a big loss of comfort for me. So here I am, agnostic, atheist, materialist, and that would have to do. And so between then and now, a lot of ground was covered. I was in therapy and that helped enormously. And somewhere in that stretch of years, I found myself really fascinated by other religions, other world religions, not as a believer, but just as someone who kept noticing that there was this common thread running through all of them. And I traveled and I took in different cultures and I saw breathtaking cathedrals and temples and sacred places, and was able to drink in the awe of what it must have taken, what kind of inspiration and longing it took for those places to come into being. And several years ago, after this is a pretty cool experience. This has to do with the shame part. After I'd already discovered mediumship, and I think I was trying to reconcile what being a medium is with my Christian background, I had a really profound experience. I was listening to the podcast On Being with Krista Tippett, and she was interviewing Jeff Chu, who had he called it midwifed and completed Rachel Held Evans' unfinished book, Wholehearted Faith. Rachel Held Evans had died suddenly in 2019, and she was a prolific writer who very vulnerably and bravely and publicly wrestled with, contemporary Christianity and fought to transform the way Christianity is perceived and taught in the United States. And I had never heard of her before, but I was completely drawn into this conversation about her life's work. And as I was listening to it, I started to feel her presence, and I could see what she looked like, and I knew that she had left behind 2 young children, like a baby, one of them a baby. And of course, I went and looked all this up after I had this experience, just to fact check it and make sure I wasn't, this wasn't just in my imagination. But as I felt her, I felt this pull to write down what I was tuning into, and I tuned into her, and I wrote this down. This is from several years ago, and I was able to look it up because I keep records of this stuff. And she said, "We are not to carry our transgressions as a burden, rather to learn from the experience to better evolve as a loving consciousness. Release the burden of shame. The freedom from this is the revelation of my lifetime." That was so profound for me. And I'm going to link this article with Jeff Chu. It's on the On Being website. I'll link that. I will link all of this in the show notes so you can check it out. So unlike Rachel, I kind of stopped trying to wrestle with Christianity. I kind of just set it aside. And it really wasn't until I became a parent that I was pulled back into those questions. And I think that's pretty universal. Like when you become a parent, you instinctively reach back towards how you were raised and you take stock of what you want to carry forward and what you want to leave behind. And I think this was when I was pregnant with my first, or I'd already had him. Someone asked me, how are you going to get your kids to behave if you don't teach them about hell? And that was just a hard pass for me. Like my kids were never going to be taught about hell. And when they were little, I tried reading them some Bible stories for a while, but I remember hitting parts that talked about a jealous God and chosen people. And there was so much, in there that I didn't want to have to answer. Like, why was God so angry? Why was there so much war and violence? And why did only some of the people make the cut? Why were some people chosen? So I again, set that aside. And then I was confronted by loss. I couldn't stay comfortable in just the material world any longer. And I've talked about this a bunch on this podcast. It's kind of how I came to mediumship. My best friend Eliza lost her 6-year-old son, who was best friends with my son at the time. And all the easy answers that I had grown up with, like, oh, he's in heaven, he's in a better place, it felt completely wrong and completely inadequate to the size of this loss. And the question was still there, though, like, how could he be fully here and alive one day and gone the next? Where was he? And if I didn't believe in hell, could I still believe in heaven? And what was I supposed to tell my kids? And it was this that I actually experienced the notion that we are spirit having a human experience. So I started keeping the door open. And if mediumship was real, and based on all the readings that my friend Eliza was getting and all the signs that she was receiving, it certainly seemed real. And if that's real, it points to the truth that we are so much more than just our bodies. And if that's the case, like, what else is true? Looking back on that now, I can also see that the prayer practice that I'd built as a kid is a real thing. It works. And I watched it come from my mom in ways that nothing else could. I just didn't have the right framework for me yet. And prayer looks completely different to me now. And it's less about asking for things. It's more about just arriving in a state of presence and a state of connection and listening to the divine. And approaching it this way has brought me more peace than I could have imagined. And what I know about myself now is that I am acutely aware when anything feels dogmatic. And this can also be within the world of mediumship or spirituality too, because there is a lot of dogma in all aspects of life, whether it's like healthcare, mental health, or even society or culture. Give me a rule, any rule, and my first question is going to be why? Why is that rule here because it genuinely works? Or is it here because it's keeping someone else from feeling unsafe? And is it making someone else feel like they're in control? And if I don't share their particular fear, do I still have to follow that rule? And I kind of feel like my kids really taught me this, because if I tried, and I got this as a kid, I bet you there's some of you out there that got this as children too, because I said so, If I said that to my kids, that was never going to fly. Maybe if I had said, well, you're going to go to hell if you don't listen to me, maybe it would have worked. But they always need to know why I'm giving them a rule. And you know what? My kids, they've turned out to be pretty good humans, and they trust their own intuition and they trust their gut to make solid decisions for themselves. And I trust them because I have learned to trust myself in that same way. And where does this all leave me now? Not with all the answers, but it leads me with what we always talk about on this podcast, that state of being in wonder and being in curiosity, and with the willingness to let things evolve and expand and grow. And the fear-based framework that I inherited was never something that was going to hold me and keep me safe for long. And it was keeping me safe, but probably trying to control me too. But I have so much compassion for that now, because we all do this. We all build frameworks to feel safe. But the question needs to be whether those frameworks are still serving us or whether we've outgrown them and need to bring awareness to that. And I've learned that my inner knowing is a valid source of guidance. I don't need to go to a pastor or a guru. I don't need a certificate on the wall and someone else's rule about the right way to pray, or the right way to connect, or the right way to have a relationship with the divine is not my own rule for myself. My own direct experience is more important. And it's probably going to look different in 10 years from now. And that kind of feels exciting. I'm looking forward to that. So if you grew up with a belief system that no longer fits you, I want you to know that you are not lost, and you're not faithless, and you're not broken, and you're not a sinner. You're evolving, and you're worthy to evolve. And you're sacred. And knowing this is the most sacred thing that there is. You don't need permission to change your mind. And you don't need to outsource your knowing to somebody who seems more enlightened or more credentialed or more certain than you. You are the one who gets to decide what your own brand of connection to the divine is. So I think that brings me to the end, dear listeners. I'm going to wrap this up. If this is helpful for you, please share this with somebody who might need it. I've thought about this for decades. And I think it's pretty relevant in our society right now. There's a lot of people who are looking at their belief systems and needing change, wanting to shift, and knowing that it's okay to do so. So you could also help us out by downloading these episodes. That would really help us out a lot. And we'll be back. We'll be back next week with new guests and a new episode. So until then, lots of love. Bye. Very Soul is our sponsor for Medium Curious. Jane and I are both Very Soul mediums.
Oh, yes, we are. verysoul.com, y'all. Inspired by spirit, guided by love, and brought to life by mediums.